You wake up with your skin sticky, sweat mixing with sand on your face. The sunlight isn't warm, it's suffocating, as though the earth itself wants to melt your bones. You walk on a path that was once marked by the heavy steps of others, but now the path is empty, empty of bodies, of stories, of life. All that remains is dust, the echo of a forgotten past. The air is thick, as though each breath weighs more than the last. The cracked and broken earth speaks to you in whispers, like a mute testament to those who passed here, dragging their bodies to offer them as trade. The desert stretches before you, infinite, and in the distance, barely visible, is the horizon, where the sky seems to swallow everything. In this vast emptiness, the humanity that once crossed this path is trapped. Their bodies, stripped of their souls, were turned into mere commodities. They walked here for a promise that never existed: wealth, power, a better future. But instead, they found a slow, desolate death buried in the earth that now crumbles beneath your feet. You look around. All that remains is oblivion. And suddenly, you wonder, what is the cost of human ambition when bodies are the currency exchanged for something as fragile as power and wealth? What happens when life itself becomes a product, reduced to its material value? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time. I'm curious to see where all you night owls are listening in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind seems to carry the whispers of those who lived and died here, their names never etched into history. The merchants, the conquerors, the victims, all of them left something behind, but for the most part, all that remained was a trail of suffering. Those bodies, those sacrifices, were nothing more than pieces in a wheel that never stopped turning. The wheels of power, ambition, control, and now only their shadow remains, relentless and eternal, passing through the desert. The sun continues to beat down on your back. The earth becomes a heavy burden, and as you continue walking, something stirs inside you, as though your soul is also being consumed by the same darkness that swallowed all those who passed before you. The empires that once upheld these trade routes crumbled, but the price of their greatness was paid in broken bodies, in forgotten lives. What happened here, along these paths, wasn't a simple exchange of goods. It was a much darker transaction. What remains when the body no longer has value, when life itself is merely a failed transaction? What remains when empires fall, but the misery they created continues to pulse in the earth, lurking, waiting to be remembered? And as you ask yourself this, the path before you stretches on, each step carrying with it the weight of a story that has yet to be told, a story that will never be forgotten. Yours, theirs, the story of those who were consumed by ambition. You look at the shimmering silk, the vibrant spices, the precious coins, all symbols of wealth, of luxury, of civilization's triumph. It's easy to romanticize these treasures, to imagine them as the essence of a world full of splendor and fortune. You can almost feel the coolness of the silks, the heat of the spices, the weight of the gold, and for a moment, you forget where they come from. You forget the bodies that have paid for them, the lives that have been broken for their creation, their movement across the world. The reality of the Silk Road isn't in the shimmering threads of fabric or the aroma of rare spices. No, the reality is in the smell of sweat, the crack of the whip, the sound of chains clinking together. It's in the hollow eyes of those who were reduced to mere commodities, bodies shackled by invisible forces. You can hear their labored breathing, smell the fear that clung to them in the desert heat, a fear that never left them, no matter how far they traveled. The workers, the enslaved, the trafficked, their suffering was the true currency of trade, the unseen cost of every luxurious good that made its way across the world. There is no beauty in the journey of these goods, no romance in the way the trade routes stretched across continents. The real path was a trail of human suffering, of those who were forced to carry unimaginable burdens, bodies that could barely walk, their faces obscured by dust, their hands raw from the weight of the goods they bore. They were not merchants, they were prisoners. The Mongols, with their vast empire, used forced labor to fuel their conquests, to build their riches. The slaves, the women, the children, all were commodified, reduced to their labor and nothing more. They were not humans, they were tools, broken and discarded when their usefulness had expired. As you continue, the images shift. You see the traders and merchants who smiled as they made their deals, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the price paid for their profits. You hear the cries of the women who were trafficked along these routes, their innocence traded for mere gold. You feel the silent tears of children who were stolen from their homes and forced to work, their tiny hands too weak to bear the weight of the world that was thrust upon them. The bodies of the innocent piled up like discarded cargo, and yet their suffering was invisible to the world, their pain lost in the grand design of empires. As the caravan moves forward, the scorching sun beats down, and the weight of the journey becomes unbearable. The workers are exhausted, their skin burnt, their bodies broken. They have become nothing more than machines in the service of trade, stripped of their dignity, their identity, their humanity. They walk in silence, their heads down, knowing that any resistance would mean death. The fear is palpable, suffocating, and yet they keep moving forward, step by agonizing step. The trading routes were not just pathways for goods, they were pathways for human exploitation. The silk, the spices, the treasures of the world were all tainted by the blood, sweat, and tears of those who were forced to create and transport them. What is the true cost of these riches? What is the price paid for the glittering wealth that the world has come to admire? It isn't in the gold or the silver. It's in the bodies that were broken to create it. It's in the lives that were destroyed so that others could live in luxury. The true cost is invisible, hidden beneath the veil of commerce and conquest, but it lingers in the earth, in the bones of those who were left behind. The question echoes in your mind, lingering like a shadow. What is the true price of the world's riches? Is it worth the destruction of so many lives, the erasure of so many souls? The silk may still shine, the spices may still smell sweet, but the stench of the suffering remains, buried beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. The dust settles over the ruins. What was once a bustling city, a thriving empire, now lies crumbling in silence. The wind whispers through the shattered remnants of what once was. The towering structures that once held the weight of power now stand as hollow shells, their broken windows staring out into the abyss, a silent testament to the fall of civilizations. The great empires of the Silk Road, Mongol, Persian, Chinese, have all but collapsed, their grandeur reduced to rubble. You walk through the streets, your footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The air feels heavy, thick with the ghosts of the past. This was a place of life, of movement, of commerce, but now it is a cemetery, a memorial to ambition gone wrong. The trade routes that once connected distant corners of the world now lie abandoned, forgotten, where the clink of coins and the hum of conversation once filled the air. There is only silence. The Mongols, whose empire stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the heart of China, once held the Silk Road in a vice grip. Their expansion was brutal, their conquests relentless, but their empire crumbled, torn apart by internal strife, by the weight of its own excesses. The vast network of trade they built, based on the blood and bodies of those they subjugated, now lays in ruin. The riches that once flowed through these routes now seem hollow, as if tainted by the suffering that created them. As the Mongol Empire collapsed, so did the lives of the laborers and slaves who had been trapped within its system. They were abandoned, forgotten, their suffering shifting from the visible to the invisible, from the empire to the shadows. The Persian Empire, too, fell, its once great cities now reduced to ghost town. The trade routes it once controlled were now little more than empty paths through a barren landscape. The Persian merchants, who once profited off the backs of the oppressed, now had nothing left to sell. The empire had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption, its own decadence. But the suffering did not cease. It merely changed form. As the empire fell, the laborers, the slaves, the trafficked women and children were scattered like dust in the wind. Their pain was no longer tied to a single empire, but to the system itself, a system that perpetuated suffering long after the empires that supported it had collapsed. And in China, the empire that once ruled over the Silk Road's eastern terminus, the collapse was no less tragic. The fall of the Yuan dynasty, which had once brought prosperity through the trade routes, left behind nothing but a shattered system. The roads that had once been the lifeline of the empire now lay abandoned, overgrown, forgotten. The merchants who once flourished under Mongol rule were now left with no empire to support them. The workers, the slaves, those whose bodies had been the true currency of trade, now wandered the ruins, their fates no longer tied to the wealth of an empire, but to the harsh reality of a world that had discarded them. In the collapse of these great empires, there is an irony that is impossible to ignore. The suffering that once flowed through the veins of these empires did not die with them. It merely shifted. It took on new forms, crept into new corners of the world, and continued to feed the hunger of progress. The riches, the goods that had once been so highly prized, now seemed insignificant in the face of the human cost. The world had moved on, but the scars of those who had been sacrificed to build it remained. In the ruins of these empires, the forgotten voices of the laborers and slaves still echo. Their stories are scattered, fragmented, and lost in time. But if you listen closely, you can hear them, the cries of those who were never given a voice. The testimony of one such survivor, an unnamed laborer whose body was broken on these very roads, haunts the silence. We were not remembered by the world, but we still remember it. We still carry the weight of what was lost. Their voices linger in the shadows, a testament to the true cost of empire. The collapse of these empires symbolizes the unraveling of the illusion progress. The great powers that built these systems, that profited from the suffering of countless others, have vanished, but the suffering remains. The human cost was never fully acknowledged, never truly accounted for. And so, as these empires crumble, the true cost of their rise becomes all the more evident. The systems they built, systems of exploitation, of control, of cruelty, have not disappeared. They live on, haunting the world long after the empires that created them are gone. What remains then after the fall? What remains after the empires crumble, after the trade routes fade into obscurity? It is the human cost, the suffering that was hidden beneath the surface of empire, the pain that was never addressed. It is a shadow that lingers, that waits to be acknowledged, that continues to shape the world in ways we have yet to fully understand. And so, as the ruins of these great empires stand silent and forgotten, the question persists: what have we lost in the name of progress? And what price will we pay for it in the end? The air is thick with the scent of sweat and fear, heavy and suffocating. You are chained to the wagon, your hands raw, your feet bleeding from the miles you've walked. The weight of the goods in the cart pulls you down, but the weight of your own body, of your own existence, feels even heavier. Each step is a reminder. You are no longer a person. You are a thing, a commodity, reduced to nothing more than an instrument of trade. Your body is not your own. It belongs to those who own the roads, those who profit from your labor, from your suffering. The cracks on your hands, the bruises on your skin, the hunger gnawing at your insides. None of it matters. No one notices. No one cares. The desert heat beats down on you like the unforgiving hand of God, and yet you keep moving, one foot after the other, as if your very life depends on it. And maybe it does. Maybe survival itself is a punishment, a cruel joke. You are no longer human. You are a thing that serves a purpose: to transport, to work, to obey. You are not allowed the luxury of rest, of thought, of escape. You are not allowed to be anything other than what they need you to be. The others around you are the same: broken bodies, empty eyes. Some walk in silence, while others mutter to themselves, their voices trembling with exhaustion, with fear. The women, their heads down, their faces obscured by dust, walk with a different kind of weight. Their bodies are not just tools of labor. They are commodities, sold to the highest bidder. They were taken from their homes, their families, and now they belong to those who see them only as objects to be used, sold for mere coins, traded like livestock, their worth reduced to their ability to satisfy desires they never asked for. The world has stolen their humanity, and in doing so, it has left them with nothing but silence. You pass by one of them, and for a brief moment, your eyes meet. There is no recognition, no comfort, just a shared understanding that you are both bound by the same invisible chains. The chains that hold you down are not just physical, they are psychological, spiritual, gnawing at you from the inside out. Every day, every hour, you feel yourself slipping further away from who you once were, from what you once hoped for. The dreams you once had are now as distant as the horizon, fading into the emptiness of a life that has no future. The cruelty is not just in the labor, it is in the system, in the eyes of those who profit from this misery. The merchants, the traders, the empires, they do not see you. They do not see the pain, the exhaustion, the degradation. They only see the goods you carry, the labor you provide. They only see the money to be made, the wealth to be gained. They are blind to the cost, to the human bodies that make their profits possible. And in their blindness, they perpetuate the cycle. They ensure that your suffering continues, that you remain nothing more than a tool in their hands. The toll on your body is visible, but it is the toll on your spirit that is the most insidious. You no longer feel like a person. You no longer feel like you have the right to exist. You are a tool, a thing to be used, and the world around you has accepted this. There is no escape. The violence you endure, the fear that clutches at your heart, the degradation of being reduced to nothing more than a body for sale. It eats away at you, slowly, like rust-consuming metal. Each day is a reminder that you are not free, that your body is not your own. But the world moves on. The wagons roll. The caravans keep going. The goods are sold. The wealth is made. And you keep walking. You are part of something larger, something invisible. You are part of the machinery that keeps the wheels of empire turning. Your name is not important. Your face does not matter. What matters is what you can carry, what you can do. You are nothing more than a cog in the wheel, and when you break, they will replace you with another. And yet, as you walk, as you carry the weight of goods that will never be yours, a question lingers. What happens to the people who are nothing more than tools? What happens when those who are used no longer have anything left to give? What happens when the chains that bind them are not just made of iron, but of time, of generations, of broken spirits? When the labor ends, what remains of the person who was once a human? The voices of those who came before you, who suffered in silence, still echo in the air. They were forgotten. Their pain, their struggles, their stories, they are lost to history, erased by those who profited from their suffering. But the truth is undeniable. The trade that built empires, the trade that made fortunes, was built on the bodies of the oppressed. And as the empires fall, their legacy remains, written in the blood and sweat of those who were never seen, never remembered. The collapse of these empires will never bring back those who were lost. The cruelty, the violence, the dehumanization, it does not fade with time. It lingers like a scar, like a wound that will never heal. The question remains, what is the cost of this legacy? What is the true price of the riches, the power, the empires built on the backs of those who were never given the chance to be free? And as you walk, your chains heavy, you realize that the question is not just historical. It is here, in this moment, in this world. What have we become if we have allowed this to happen? What have we become if we are willing to look away from the suffering that sustains our world? You walk, your feet dragging along the dust, but the weight you feel is not from the journey. It is something heavier, something invisible, yet all-encompassing. The air is thick with a smell, not just of sweat and fear, but of sickness, of rot. You can't see it, but it's there. It lurks in every corner of the trade routes, in every stop, in every face you pass. Plague, smallpox, disease. It clings to the air, to the bodies, to the soul. It moves as a shadow, spreading silently, carried by the bodies of those who have already been broken by the world. The same bodies that carry silk, spices, and treasures now carry death. The same hands that labor under the sun now hold the fate of empires in their trembling palms. The workers, the slaves, the trafficked, all of them are vessels, not just for the goods they carry, but for the sickness that travels with them. They are the carriers of a death that has no mercy, They are the vessels for the Black Death that will sweep through entire cities, entire nations, wiping out those who are already weak, already worn down by years of brutal labor and abuse. It starts small, a cough, a fever, the first signs of a sickness that will soon consume them whole. And yet, the journey continues. They are told to keep moving, to keep working, to keep surviving. But there is no escaping it. The traders, the merchants, they do not see the bodies behind the goods. They do not see the workers who carry the weight of their empire on their backs, slowly succumbing to the plague. They do not hear the coughs in the night, the moans of the dying. They do not see the bodies left behind in the sand, the ones that cannot keep going. The plague spreads silently, as if it too were part of the trade, moving with the caravans, moving from one body to another. It's not just a disease, it is a weapon, a tool of the trade, a commodity in its own right. The Black Death becomes the central metaphor for this cycle. It is not just a disease, not just an illness. It is a force, an inevitable end, sweeping across the lands. It follows the trade routes like a shadow, claiming lives with the same indifference as the empires that built the Silk Road. You are not just a worker, not just a slave, not just a laborer. You are a vessel, a container for death. Your body, already ravaged by exploitation and abuse, becomes the perfect host for the disease. It feeds on your weakness, your fatigue, your vulnerability. The toll is visible in the dark circles beneath the eyes, in the pallor of skin, in the sunken faces of those who know their time is coming. But the toll is also invisible, because it is not just the body that is dying. It is the spirit. It is the dignity that was already eroded by years of labor, of violence, of cruelty. Now, death comes not as a release, but as the final act of exploitation. The rich, the powerful, the merchants, all continue their trade, unaffected, untouched by the suffering. They remain untouched by the plague because they are far removed from it, far removed from the bodies that carry it. Their wealth is built on the backs of the dying, the diseased, and as they continue to trade, they trade in death. Even death is a commodity on the Silk Road. It is packaged, transported, and sold like any other good. The disease that takes so many lives is just another byproduct of the trade, something inevitable, something unavoidable. Just as the workers are reduced to tools, so too are their deaths reduced to transactions. There is no honor in death on the Silk Road. It is not a peaceful end, not a natural conclusion. It is a violent, painful, suffocating process. And when it comes, it does not discriminate. The poor, the broken, the enslaved, the exploited, they are the first to die. And when the traders and merchants eventually succumb, it will be too late. The cycle of exploitation, of suffering, will have come full circle. The irony is inescapable. These bodies, these vessels for disease, are the very same bodies that have been used for the trade, the bodies that have built the empires, that have created the wealth. And yet, when they are no longer useful, they are discarded, left to rot on the side of the road, their deaths forgotten, the riches made from the exploitation of their lives, the luxury that was built on their suffering. It all crumbles, but not in a way that can be seen. It crumbles in the silence of their graves, in the whispers of the ghosts that linger in the ruins. As you walk, you can almost feel the sickness creeping up on you. The bodies of those who came before you are all around you, scattered like forgotten refuse. Their deaths were not a release, but a cruel end to lives already stolen. The question lingers in the air, thick with despair. What is the true cost of wealth? What is the price of progress when it is built on the bodies of the dying? Even in death, there is no escape. There is no freedom, only the endless cycle of exploitation, of suffering, of death. And as the caravan moves forward, you cannot help but wonder, who will be the next to fall? The empire has fallen. The trade routes are empty now, overgrown by time and forgotten by the world. The roads that once hummed with the sound of wheels on cobblestones, the clink of coins, the cries of traders and laborers are silent. The great cities that once flourished are now crumbling ruins, their grandeur lost to history. The riches that once flowed so freely are no longer flowing, and the names of those who built empires are now forgotten. But those who survived, those who were left behind, they carry something with them, something invisible, something heavy. They walk through the world as ghosts, haunted by the memories of what they endured. The scars they bear are not just physical, they are emotional, psychological. The long-term effects of the trauma they experienced are like an unbroken thread, weaving through the fabric of their lives, through the lives of their children and their children's children. The trauma of the Silk Road did not end when the trade routes collapsed. It did not end with the fall of the empires. It lived on, passed down like a curse, a silent inheritance that no one asked for, but that everyone had to bear. The survivors, if they were lucky enough to survive, are left to navigate a world that has forgotten them. Their pain is not acknowledged. Their suffering is erased from the historical narrative, buried beneath the shiny facade of the goods they helped move, the empires they helped build. They are left with nothing but the weight of their experiences and the overwhelming silence that surrounds them. No one remembers the laborers, the slaves, the trafficked people. They are forgotten, their stories buried in the sands of time. And yet, their suffering does not go away. It lingers like an echo in the back of the mind, like a shadow that can never be fully escaped. The emotional toll they carry is not something that can be measured in time, in years. It stretches across generations, like an invisible wound that never heals. The trauma is passed down from parent to child, from one generation to the next. It is carried in the way they hold their bodies, in the way they speak, in the way they relate to the world around them. It is carried in the silence that surrounds them, in the unspoken grief that they cannot put into words. It is in the way they look at the world, knowing that their pain, their loss, has no place in it. It is in the way they are erased over and over again from the history that celebrates the empire, the trade, the luxury. The very people who built the foundations of this world are forgotten, their stories never told, their suffering never acknowledged, and yet their pain remains, quietly simmering beneath the surface, a reminder that no one can ever truly escape the weight of what they've endured. And now, in the present day, their legacy continues to haunt the world. The world we live in is shaped by the same systems of exploitation, the same cycles of cruelty. The modern world may have moved on from the Silk Road, but it has not moved on from the trauma it created. The same forces that shaped the past continue to shape the present. The same systems of power, of exploitation, of inequality. The suffering of those who were forgotten continues to reverberate through the centuries, casting long shadows over the lives of those who came after them. You see it every day in the faces of the oppressed, in the stories of those who have been left behind. The trauma of history is not something that can be neatly tied up in a bow, not something that can be easily forgotten. It is a wound that is still open, still bleeding, still infecting everything it touches. The ghosts of the Silk Road still walk among us, their voices still silenced, their stories still untold. And we, the living, are left to grapple with the weight of their suffering. And yet, the question remains, is healing even possible for those whose suffering is buried in the sands of history? Can we ever truly heal from the wounds that have been passed down through generations? Can we ever acknowledge the pain that has been hidden, the trauma that has been erased? Or are we destined to carry the burden of history, to live with the ghosts of the past haunting us every step of the way? The answer is not easy. Healing is not simple. It is not a process that can be completed in a day, a year, or even a lifetime. It takes time, it takes reckoning, and it takes remembering. But for those whose suffering has been buried, whose pain has been forgotten, healing may seem impossible. The scars are too deep, the wounds too long neglected. And yet, there is a flicker of hope, a small light that shines through the darkness. Because even though history has tried to erase the voices of the oppressed, their stories still remain, the memories still linger, and perhaps, just perhaps, it is in the act of remembering, of acknowledging the suffering that has been buried, that healing begins. You walk through the ruins of what once was, the cities, the trade routes, the empires. What remains is a landscape of silence. The grand structures, the glorious monuments to conquest, have crumbled to dust. The wealth and power of those who once ruled have vanished, scattered like ash in the wind. But what of the voices that built this world? What of the countless lives that were sacrificed, their names lost to the endless tides of history? Where are they? Where are the ones who carried the weight of empires on their backs, who lived and died in silence, erased by the very forces that elevated those who profited from their pain? They were forgotten, their names never etched into stone, their stories never written down. They were erased from the historical narrative, reduced to mere footnotes, if they were even mentioned at all. Their lives were never meant to be remembered. They were not important. They were not worthy of being remembered. They were just laborers, slaves, commodities. Their stories were lost in the grand scheme of empire building, lost to the pursuit of power and wealth. But there is something deeply unsettling in this. What does it mean when entire lives are erased, when entire generations are forgotten? What does it mean when the history we know is not the full history, but the history written by those who had the power to decide who gets to be remembered and who does not? In the silence of the ruins, their voices echo. They are still there, still speaking, still waiting to be heard. And so, we must listen. We must dig through the ancient texts, the survivor testimonies, the fragments of history that remain. We must search for the voices that were lost, for the stories that were never told. Because the truth is, their suffering was not an accident. It was a consequence of the empire, a necessary byproduct of the system that thrived on their labor, their bodies, their lives. They were not a part of history by choice, but by force. And yet, history has chosen to forget them, to bury them beneath the wealth and glory of the empires they helped build. Consider the ancient texts that speak of the grandeur of empires, of the riches that flowed through the trade routes. Consider the survivors who lived to tell their stories, who were scarred by the very system that gave birth to the empires. Their testimonies are fragments, scattered and incomplete, but they are there if we are willing to listen. One survivor writes, "We were not even given the dignity of death. Our names were not spoken, our lives not worth the ink it would take to write them." These words carry with them a weight that is impossible to ignore. They remind us that the cost of empire was not just in the blood spilled in battle, but in the lives of those who were left to rot, forgotten, erased. Their silence is deafening. It is the silence of those who were forced into labor, who were traded like livestock, who were commodified for the benefit of others. It is the silence of those who were buried in unmarked graves, who were forgotten the moment they died. It is the silence of those who never had the opportunity to speak, to tell their stories, to claim their place in history. But their stories are not lost forever. They can still be found if we are willing to look. We must turn over the stones of history and uncover the lives that have been buried beneath them. We must listen to the echoes of the past and bring those voices back to life. We must remember that history is not just the story of the victors, of the powerful, of the rich. It is also the story of the oppressed, the forgotten, the silenced. And yet, even as we remember them, we must also ask, who gets to write history? Who decides whose story is worth telling and whose is not? History has always been written by those in power, by those who have the means to preserve their version of events. But in doing so, they have distorted the truth. They have erased the suffering of those who built the empires, those who paid the price for progress. The ethical cost of empire building is not just in the lives lost in battle, but in the lives forgotten, in the voices erased, in the people whose pain was used to create a future that they would never see. The question is not just about the past. It is about the present, about how we continue to tell the story of the world we live in. We live in a world that continues to erase the voices of the oppressed, that continues to bury their suffering beneath the weight of power and wealth. Who are we leaving behind? Who are we choosing to forget as you stand in the ruins, the wind picking up, carrying with it the echoes of the past? You can almost hear their voices, faint but persistent. They are calling out from the shadows of history, asking us to remember, asking us to listen. Their stories may have been lost, but they are not gone. They are still here, still waiting to be heard. It is our responsibility to hear them, to carry their stories forward, to give them the place they were never given in history. Only then can we truly understand the cost of empire, the cost of progress, the cost of the suffering that built the world we live in today. The air is thick with the stench of sweat and leather, the creak of carts heavy with goods that will never belong to those who carry them. In the distance, the merchant stands tall, his eyes gleaming with the promise of riches, his hands clasped tightly around the coins that are already as good as his. The goods he sells, silk, spices, gold, are born of suffering, born of bodies that were never meant to carry such a weight. He doesn't see them, not really. He only sees what's in his hand. The goods, the riches, the future, the bodies that made this possible are nothing more than a background blur, a mere tool in the machine of empire building. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for goods. It was a path for dehumanization, a conveyor belt that stripped people of their dignity and humanity, reducing them to mere commodities, tools in the pursuit of wealth. The empires that stretched across Asia, the Middle East, and into Europe flourished on the backs of those who were coerced into labor, those who were trafficked, enslaved, and discarded when they were no longer useful. These people, once human, became nothing more than objects, tools for the trade, tools for the empire. The Mongols, with their relentless march across the land, were the masters of this machinery. They built their empire on forced labor, using the bodies of the conquered to fuel their wars of conquest and their trade. The Persians followed a similar pattern, profiting from the bodies of slaves who worked their fields, their mines, their caravans. The Chinese, too, turned human beings into tools, laborers who worked in conditions that would break the strongest of bodies. These empires built their economies not on the labor of free men and women, but on the backs of those who had no voice, no choice. They were reduced to objects, their bodies transformed into raw material for the empire's expansion. The dark irony here, the cruelty that runs through the veins of history, is the hypocrisy that these empires embodied. They preached civilization, progress, and order while participating in the most barbaric forms of human exploitation. They claimed to bring the light of civilization to the uncivilized regions they conquered, but the truth was far darker. They built their wealth on the suffering of the very people they claimed to uplift. The Silk Road, that symbol of human connection, was built on the backs of those who had no choice but to follow it, no choice but to become cogs in a machine that existed for the benefit of the few. It was not just the merchants who profited, though their role in the system was significant. The empires themselves, with their insatiable hunger for more land, more wealth, more power, created the systems that allowed this exploitation to continue. The traders who filled their coffers with silk and spices were the outward face of this system, but it was the empires that created and maintained it. They established the laws, the trade routes, the economic structures that facilitated this dehumanization. They were the architects of a system where human life meant nothing more than its usefulness in the grand economic machine. But it is not just a story of distant empires and ancient civilizations. The legacy of the Silk Road lives on today, in the ways we continue to exploit labor, in the ways we continue to commodify human beings. The global supply chains that bring us goods from all corners of the earth are built on the same systems of forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking that once sustained the Silk Road. The people who work in sweatshops, who are trapped in the cycle of modern slavery, are the descendants of those who were commodified centuries ago. They, too, are reduced to mere objects, tools for the benefit of those at the top, those who profit from their suffering. So, we must ask ourselves, how do we reconcile human progress with human exploitation? How do we justify the wealth and luxury of empires built on the backs of those who had no voice, no agency? How do we look at our modern world with its shiny products and its endless flow of goods and reconcile it with the knowledge that these goods come at a cost that has been paid in human lives? It is an uncomfortable question, one that forces us to confront the ugly side of progress, the price we have paid for the comforts we enjoy. We like to believe that humanity is evolving, that we are moving toward a better, more just world. But how much has truly changed? Have we really left behind the systems of exploitation? Or have we simply refined them, made them more invisible, more distant? The people who work in the factories, the mines, the fields, are they not the same as those who carried goods across the Silk Road? Are they not still being reduced to tools for the benefit of others? The dark truth is that, in many ways, we have not moved as far as we would like to believe. The same systems of dehumanization that built empires centuries ago continue to exist today. They may be more hidden, more complex, but they are still there, lurking beneath the surface of our global economy. And as long as we continue to ignore the true cost of the goods we consume, we continue to perpetuate the cycle of exploitation. The Silk Road may have faded into history, but its legacy lives on in the shadows of our modern world. The bodies may no longer be shackled, but the system that shackled them is still very much alive. And until we confront this truth, until we ask ourselves the difficult questions about the cost of progress, we will continue to walk the same path, one paved by the suffering of those who have been forgotten, their lives reduced to mere tools in the service of empire. The glittering treasures of the Silk Road, the silk that shimmered like liquid gold in the sunlight, the spices that filled the air with exotic fragrances, the precious jewels that gleamed like stars. These were the symbols of prosperity, the marks of empire. To the outside world, they were the essence of wealth, the products of human ingenuity, of civilization's triumph. These riches flowed through the hands of kings, emperors, and merchants who bathed in their luxuries, wearing them like a crown, a badge of their power. They built their palaces, their monuments, their dynasties on these goods, claiming the spoils of conquest as a sign of their greatness. But beneath the glitter and glamour, there was a darker truth, a truth that no amount of silk or gold could hide. For beneath the veil of luxury, beneath the layers of opulence, lay a human cost too great to ignore. The riches that flowed through the Silk Road were not the fruits of peaceful trade or prosperous exchange. They were the result of human suffering, of lives reduced to mere commodities, of people who had no choice but to contribute to the wealth of the empires. Every piece of silk that crossed the road was woven by hands that had been broken by exhaustion and abuse. Every spice, every precious stone was transported by bodies that had been chained, whipped, and forced to march across unforgiving deserts through hostile lands with no regard for their lives. These workers, these slaves, these trafficked men, women, and children were the silent foundation of the wealth that flowed along the Silk Road. Their lives, their suffering, were the invisible price that was paid for every luxury that filled the palaces of emperors, every golden coin that clinked in the pockets of traders. The glittering treasures were the facade, the illusion of glory. Behind them was an underbelly of misery that was hidden from the eyes of those who profited from it. To the traders, to the kings, to the merchants, the people who bore the weight of their wealth were invisible. They were nothing more than tools, their suffering an afterthought, their lives worth only what they could carry or produce. The wealth that was built on this suffering was fragile, like a house of cards. The riches of the empires were founded on the exploitation of those who had no power, no voice, no escape. The Silk Road may have been a symbol of human connection, but it was also a symbol of the deep inequality that underpinned that connection. The goods that were traded, the treasures that crossed the continents, were the products of a system that had no regard for the humanity of those who made it all possible. As the Silk Road reached its peak, the empires that controlled it grew bloated, their wealth growing ever more concentrated in the hands of the few, while the suffering of the many continued to be ignored. The workers, the slaves, the trafficked, They were seen as nothing more than instruments of empire, tools for trade, their lives expendable. The Silk Road was not a path of mutual benefit, but a path of exploitation. The empires that controlled it were built on the backs of those who had no choice but to suffer for the wealth of others. But empires, like everything else, fall. The Silk Road, once a lifeline that connected distant civilizations, began to lose its power. The rise of new trade routes, the collapse of empires, the advent of new technologies, all of these forces contributed to the slow death of the Silk Road. As the empires fell, their riches crumbled, their monuments to their glory turning to dust. But the human cost, the suffering that had fueled these empires, did not disappear. It lingered, haunting the world long after the trade routes were abandoned. The final days of the Silk Road were hollow. The empires that had once flourished on the backs of the oppressed were reduced to ruins, their treasure scattered and forgotten. The wealth, once so glittering, now seemed meaningless, a hollow shell of what it had once been. The laborers, the slaves, the trafficked, they were no longer needed. They were left behind, forgotten in the shadow of the empires that had profited from their suffering. Their lives had been spent, their bodies broken, their stories erased from history. They had built the empire, but they had never been allowed to claim a part of it. And so, as the Silk Road fades into history, we are left with the truth that no amount of treasure can erase. The wealth of the empires was built on human suffering, and that suffering remains unaddressed and ignored. The Silk Road may be gone, but the legacy of what it represented, the exploitation, the cruelty, the disregard for human life, remains. It lives on in the shadows, in the stories that were never told, in the voices that were never heard. The question we must ask ourselves, then, is this: what is the true cost of wealth? What is the cost of empire? What is the price paid for the luxury, the glitter, the power? It is not just the lives that were lost, the bodies that were broken. It is the moral cost, the ethical cost, the human cost. It is a price that can never be fully paid, a debt that can never be repaid, and it is a legacy that continues to haunt us long after the treasures have faded, long after the empires have fallen. The world has changed, or so we're told. The Silk Road is no more. The empires that once ruled it have crumbled into dust, and the goods that once traveled its paths have been replaced by a modern flow of trade, goods, and capital. The cities, the roads, the merchants, all replaced by towering skyscrapers, global companies, and digital transactions. And yet, beneath the sleek surface of our global economy, beneath the glossy products we consume, the same patterns of exploitation persist. The same human costs, the same cycles of suffering have merely evolved, taking on new forms, hidden behind the veils of modern trade and commerce. In the age of globalization, the methods may be more sophisticated, the chains more invisible, but the exploitation of human bodies continues as it always has. The modern supply chain, the network that brings the clothes we wear, the electronics we use, the food we eat, is built on the backs of those who are forced to work in conditions that degrade them, strip them of their dignity, and reduce them to tools in the service of consumption. Child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, these are not relics of a distant past. They are part of the very fabric of the global economy, woven into the products we buy and the comforts we enjoy. In the factories of the world, in the mines where raw materials are extracted, in the fields where food is grown. There are people whose lives are no different from those who walked the Silk Road centuries ago. They work in dangerous conditions, their bodies pushed to the limit, their lives shortened by the weight of the work they do. They are forced to labor for little more than survival, their rights ignored, their voices silenced. The modern version of the Silk Road may not be a series of roads crossing the desert, but it is a network of exploitation that spans the globe, connecting the wealthy and the powerful to the vulnerable and the oppressed. The irony is impossible to ignore. The luxury goods that flow across the world today, the smartphones, the designer clothing, the electronics, are made by the hands of those who live in poverty, whose lives are little more than a commodity in the global market. The laborers in these factories, the children working in mines, the women trafficked for sex, they are the modern equivalent of those who worked the ancient trade routes. They are the ones who make the wealth that flows through the hands of the rich, the ones who make the products that we consume, and yet they receive none of the benefits. Their suffering is hidden, their exploitation made invisible by the systems that keep them trapped, but the cost is still there. It is in the eyes of the workers who are forced to work 16-hour shifts in sweatshops, in the cries of children who are sold into slavery, in the families who live in the shadows of the global economy, forgotten and unseen. It is in the environmental degradation, the destruction of land and water, that results from this unchecked system of exploitation. It is in the bodies that are broken, the lives that are lost, and the generations that are lost to the cycle of poverty and exploitation. And so, the question lingers, echoing through time. Have we truly learned from the past, or have we merely replaced one form of human cost with another? We tell ourselves that we live in a more enlightened age, that the horrors of the past are behind us, that slavery and exploitation are things of a distant history. And yet, how much has really changed? We no longer see the chains of the workers in the factories, the children in the fields, the women in brothels, but they are still there. The systems of oppression, of exploitation, are still running beneath the surface, still feeding the wealth of the few at the expense of the many. The modern world may be more complex, more interconnected, but the fundamental truth remains. The wealth that powers our global economy is still built on the backs of those who have no power, no voice, and no escape. The Silk Road may have faded, but the patterns of exploitation it created continue to shape the world we live in today. The suffering that sustained ancient trade routes has never truly been eradicated. It has merely adapted, taking on new forms, moving into new spaces, hiding itself behind the facade of progress and prosperity. In the end, the question we must ask ourselves is not whether we have learned from the past, but whether we are willing to confront it. Are we willing to acknowledge the cost of the goods we consume, the labor that powers our global economy, the human lives that are sacrificed for our comforts? The truth is that the systems of exploitation that built the Silk Road are still with us, still shaping the world, still costing lives. The only thing that has changed is that we no longer see it. We no longer want to see it. And so, we live in a world where the same cycles of suffering continue, where the bodies of the oppressed are still used to build the wealth of the powerful. The question remains, what will it take for us to truly confront the cost of globalization, to recognize the human suffering that underpins the wealth we so readily consume? How long will we continue to allow history to repeat itself, to hide behind the illusion of progress, while the bodies of the forgotten continue to be used as tools for the benefit of the few? The empire has fallen. The bustling trade routes are empty. The once glorious cities, now only a shadow of what they once were. The Silk Road is no longer a path of prosperity, but a trail of decay, a reminder of the fragile nature of empire. What remains now? In the aftermath of such a monumental collapse, the goods that once flowed freely are gone. The wealth that built these empires has turned to dust. The merchants, the traders, the conquerors all have faded into history. What is left are the ruins, the decayed remnants of a world built on the backs of those who were never seen, never acknowledged, never given a chance to live. You walk through these ruins, the silence heavy around you, broken only by the wind as it stirs the rubble. The once mighty structures, the palaces, the marketplaces, the temples, now all lie in ruins. What once echoed with the sounds of commerce and power now only holds the ghosts of those who built it all. The stones that once shone with the brilliance of empire are now chipped, cracked, weathered by time and neglect. There is no glory in these ruins, no triumph, just emptiness. But the ruins are not just of cities. They are the remnants of lives. The people who built these empires, who labored and suffered in silence, are gone. Their stories never told, their sacrifices forgotten. They were the unseen foundation of these civilizations. And now, as the empires crumble, so too does their memory. They are the ones who died for the glory of others, who were consumed by the very systems they helped create. And when those systems collapsed, they were left behind, forgotten, lost in the dust. The survivors, if they are lucky enough to survive, walk through the aftermath like ghosts. They carry with them the scars of their past, the weight of a history that has erased them. They are the ones who bore the brunt of the trade, the ones whose bodies were used to build the riches of the empires. And now they must carry that burden into a world that has largely forgotten them. There is no place for them in the new world. The empires have fallen, but the systems of exploitation that sustain them have not disappeared. The survivors are left to wander through the ruins, their suffering ignored, their lives insignificant in the face of the new power structures that have replaced the old. As you walk with them, you can see it in their eyes, the emptiness, the disillusionment, the quiet resignation that comes from a lifetime of suffering. They have lived through horrors that few could imagine, and now, when the world is supposed to be rebuilding, they are left with nothing but the weight of their memories. The scars on their bodies may heal, but the scars on their souls, the ones that are invisible, the ones that run deep, remain. These are the people who paid the price for empire, who gave everything for the glory of those who would never know their names. The collapse of the Silk Road was not just the end of an era. It was the end of an entire way of life for millions of people who had been trapped within it. And yet, there is no reckoning, no apology, no attempt to make amends. The empires have fallen, but the suffering remains, lingering in the shadows, unseen, unacknowledged. The bodies of the dead, the lives of the forgotten, are left to rot in the ruins, while the world moves on, indifferent to their pain. The true cost of empire is not just the riches it accumulates, but the lives it destroys. The wealth of the Silk Road may have filled the coffers of the powerful, but it came at the expense of those who had no choice but to contribute to it. The collapse of these empires does not erase the human toll. The bodies may be gone, the cities may be in ruins, but the emotional wreckage, the devastation of lives that were never valued, remains. The survivors, left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, carry the scars of a world that used them, that discarded them, and that has largely forgotten them. And in this forgotten silence, a haunting question lingers. What happens to those whose suffering is never acknowledged, whose pain is never repaid? The world has moved on, leaving them behind, but their stories are still there, buried beneath the rubble, waiting to be heard. These are the echoes of the past, the voices of those who were sacrificed for the glory of empire. The question is whether we will ever hear them, whether we will ever face the consequences of what we have done. As you stand in the ruins, you realize that the collapse of empire is not an end. It is a beginning, the beginning of a reckoning that has yet to come. The survivors may be forgotten now, but their stories will not remain buried forever. The legacy of what was built on their suffering will one day be revealed, and perhaps in that revelation there will be a chance for the world to finally confront the cost of empire, the cost of progress, and the cost of the lives that were lost along the way. The years may pass, but the echoes of suffering never truly fade. It is as if the wounds of the past are stitched into the fabric of time itself, their threads fraying but never fully breaking. The Silk Road, once a lifeline of trade and connection, was, in truth, a path of human cost. Lives were lost, bodies were broken, and entire civilizations were shaped by the invisible hand of exploitation. And yet, as the centuries pass, we still feel the weight of those lives, still sense the cold breath of history upon us, whispering that their pain has not been forgotten. In the ancient trade routes that span the East and West, where goods and ideas flowed freely, there was also a flood of human suffering. Slaves, trafficked across vast distances, were the hidden bloodline of commerce, and their bodies were the currency of empires. It was a time of imperial ambition, where empires rose on the backs of the oppressed, and the price of luxury was paid in sweat, blood, and life itself. But as these great empires crumbled, as they fell into the sands of history, what remains? The monuments, the artifacts, the wealth, all are gone or diminished, but the human cost persists, woven into the landscape like a stain that cannot be washed away. It is a strange thing, the way human suffering lingers. It does not simply vanish with the passing of years. It seeps into the soil, into the bones of those who have endured it, and it travels through the ages, manifesting in new forms, in new injustices. The history of the Silk Road, for all its grandeur, is not a tale of great conquests and glorious achievements. It is a story of human endurance, of resilience in the face of brutality, of a cycle of pain that continues to this day. As you consider the history of this trade route, you realize that the suffering it bore is not confined to the past. In fact, it is very much alive today, reflected in the modern systems of exploitation, in the labor that fuels the engines of global capitalism. The garments you wear, the technology you use, the food you eat, each is tied to a history of oppression that continues to unfold in real time. The faces have changed, but the systems of exploitation remain eerily similar. The names may be different, but the struggle is the same. Those who are displaced, those who are trafficked, those who toil in invisible factories, They are the descendants of those who walked the ancient roads, who suffered beneath the weight of empires. It is almost as if history has learned nothing. We speak of progress, of civilization, of human rights, but for all our advances, the systems of exploitation continue to thrive. The suffering that once marked the Silk Road now finds new expressions in the shadows of modern society. The wealthy continue to consume, and the poor continue to pay the price. Though the names of the victims are often erased, their faces blurred by the passage of time, we have created a world that perpetuates the same inequalities, the same hierarchies, and in doing so, we repeat the mistakes of the past. And so, the question must be asked, what role do we play in this cycle? What part do we have in a world that refuses to fully acknowledge its past? We are the inheritors of these systems, whether we acknowledge it or not. We live in a world shaped by the same forces of greed, power, and exploitation that once fueled the Silk Road. We too are complicit in the suffering that continues to unfold in the shadows, and yet we remain largely unaware, content in our ignorance, as the world continues to spin on its axis, unchanged. Perhaps it is because we are afraid to face the truth. Perhaps it is easier to look away, to convince ourselves that the suffering of others is not our problem, that it belongs to a past long forgotten. But in doing so, we ignore the very real consequences of our actions, both past and present. The suffering that began on the Silk Road has not been erased. It has simply been displaced, hidden beneath the veil of modernity. The truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that human suffering persists because we have allowed it to. We have built systems that perpetuate it, systems that benefit from the exploitation of others. We have normalized inequality, poverty, and injustice, and in doing so, we have become complicit in the very structures that sustain them. It is a bitter pill to swallow, this realization that we are not innocent, that we are not free from the chains of history. But there is something more insidious at work here. It is not just that we have forgotten the past. It is that we refuse to remember it. We erase the stories of those who suffered. We ignore the voices of the oppressed. And we continue to perpetuate the very systems that cause their pain. It is as if the past is too painful to confront, too shameful to acknowledge, and so we turn away, choosing instead to focus on the shiny surface of progress, on the illusion of a world that has moved beyond its dark history. But the past is never truly gone. It lingers, a ghost that haunts the present, whispering its truths to those who are willing to listen. The pain of the Silk Road, the suffering of those who walked its path, is not some distant memory. It is a part of us, a part of the world we have created, and it will continue to shape our future unless we choose to confront it. To ignore it is to be complicit in the cycle of oppression, in the cycle of suffering that continues to unfold in our world. We must ask ourselves, how long will we continue to turn away? How long will we allow the past to shape our present, unacknowledged, unspoken? We must choose, as individuals and as a society, whether we will continue to be complicit in this cycle or whether we will finally break free, confront the past, and demand a world where suffering is not allowed to persist. History is not a linear progression toward a better future. It is a tangled web of triumph and tragedy, of progress and regression, of light and darkness. The suffering of the Silk Road will never be fully erased, but it does not have to continue. The past is never dead. It is only waiting to be remembered. And in remembering, we have the power to change the future. But we must first confront the truth of the past, no matter how painful it may be. Even in the darkest corners of history, where the weight of oppression seemed insurmountable, there are whispers of resistance. They are faint at first, like the soft rustling of leaves before a storm, but they grow, persist, and refuse to be silenced. The Silk Road, often remembered for the empires it connected and the wealth it generated, also bore witness to stories of defiance, of the oppressed finding ways to resist, to reclaim their dignity, however fleeting that moment of freedom might be. These stories are not the ones etched in stone or celebrated in grand histories, but they are the ones that burn quietly in the heart of humanity, refusing to be forgotten. Amidst the sprawling trade networks, where empires stretched their limbs across the earth, there were always those who resisted the system that sought to crush them. The slaves who were forced to carry goods from one end of the world to the other, their bodies commodities in a market built on exploitation, sometimes fought back in ways both subtle and violent. It was not always the great rebellions that are remembered, but the small acts of defiance, the moments when a single individual or a small group decided they would not bow, they would not break. In 743 CE, in the heart of the Tang dynasty, a slave rebellion erupted, small but fierce, shaking the empire to its core. The Tang had built their wealth on the backs of slaves, those who had been captured or born into servitude. For years, these men and women had labored in silence, their pain a hidden current beneath the surface of the empire's grand facade. But the rebellion that broke out in the city of Chang'an was not just the uprising of a few. It was a cry that echoed through the streets, a desperate howl of those who had been silenced for too long. The uprising was crushed, of course, as such rebellions often were, but it left behind a legacy, a whisper that told others resistance is possible, no matter how impossible it may seem. And it wasn't just the oppressed who rose in rebellion. Even the empires themselves, vast and seemingly unbreakable, could not escape the pressure that came from within. The Mongol Empire, which once stretched its shadow over the entirety of Eurasia, began to fracture as the weight of its internal contradictions took hold. The Mongols, though conquerors of a large part of the world, were not immune to the forces of rebellion. The empire, built on military might and the brutal subjugation of peoples, eventually saw uprisings from its own soldiers from within the very heart of its empire. The resentment of those forced to carry out its relentless campaigns eventually tore at the fabric of Mongol rule. Rebellions rose in places like Persia and China, fueled by both the exhaustion of constant warfare and the desire for freedom. Though the empire never completely fell, it fractured, its once solid core weakened by the very rebellions that tried to claw their way into existence. But it is important to remember that these were not just political or military movements. They were, at their core, acts of human dignity. Every revolt, every act of defiance, no matter how small or unsuccessful, was a refusal to accept a life of complete submission. It was a statement that, no matter the oppression, human dignity could never be fully crushed. Even the smallest of victories, those fleeting moments when the shackles were momentarily loosened, were triumphs of the human spirit. They were reminders that no matter how much suffering one endures, the ability to resist, to fight for a shred of dignity, is never fully taken away. There were, of course, those who never saw their victories, those who fought and died without ever knowing that they had sparked a flame that would spread. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The very act of resistance itself is an affirmation of life, a declaration that the human spirit cannot be extinguished by any empire or system. And though these acts were often crushed swiftly and brutally, they became part of the undercurrent of history, fueling further resistance, seeping into the consciousness of those who would one day rise again. For those who lived in the shadows of these great empires, there were always moments, however brief, where the tides seemed to turn. Slaves in the fields, merchants who lived in fear, soldiers on the front lines, all of them experienced these moments of defiance, these fleeting breaths of freedom. The human spirit does not die easily. It finds ways to resist, to push back against even the most suffocating forces. The Silk Road, then, is not just a story of commerce and conquest. It is a story of the fight for dignity, of the small rebellions that form the heart of a much larger struggle. Perhaps the greatest victory, in the end, is not in the success of these uprisings, but in the fact that they happened at all. In a world where everything seemed to be stacked against them, these moments of resistance are like sparks in the darkness. They remind us that, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the crushing weight of history, human beings will always find a way to fight for their dignity, even when the world turns a blind eye, even when the empire falls silent. The fight for freedom continues. It is a bittersweet truth, isn't it? That while the systems of oppression may seem all-consuming, they are not invincible. They crumble, not all at once, but through the small, relentless acts of defiance. The fight for freedom, though often hopeless, is never completely lost. Every rebellion, every whisper of resistance becomes a thread in the tapestry of human history. Even in the most oppressive of times, there is always the possibility of breaking free, of reclaiming something lost. It is a slow, painful process, but one that continues to this day. And so, we are left with this paradox. In the midst of overwhelming darkness, there is always light, however faint. The stories of those who resisted, who fought back against impossible odds, leave us with a bittersweet hope. Their struggles, though often crushed, were not in vain. They are the living reminders that no matter how brutal the oppression, the fight for freedom, for dignity, continues. And in that fight, there is always the possibility of victory, even if that victory is only a single, fleeting moment in the long expanse of time. In the end, we are reminded that the darkness is not complete. It is never complete, not as long as there are those willing to resist, willing to fight for a world where human dignity cannot be so easily trampled. The fight continues. It always does. There is a weight to the past that lingers in the air, a pressure that settles deep into the bones, unshakable, impossible to ignore. When the wounds of history are so vast, so deep, can healing ever truly be achieved? Or do we, as a society, simply walk through life carrying the weight of these unhealed scars, pretending they are not there? The history of human suffering is not a distant story. It is our story, woven into the very fabric of our existence. And though we may try to bury it, to move forward, there is no escaping the fact that it will always be with us. Healing, when it comes, is never simple. It is not a straight path or an easy one. It is a jagged road filled with sharp turns and obstacles that seem insurmountable. To heal is to confront the rawness of our wounds, to face the trauma that has been buried in the dark corners of our collective memory. But this confrontation is necessary. Without it, there can be no true healing. To ignore the sins of the past, to deny the suffering that has been inflicted, is to perpetuate that suffering, to allow it to fester and spread. The Silk Road, with its brutal exploitation and the suffering it inflicted, is a haunting example of a past that cannot be left unaddressed. The people who were enslaved, trafficked, and abused for the benefit of empires and traders, their pain is still with us, embedded in the stories we choose to ignore. And as much as we may want to distance ourselves from it, that pain lingers like a shadow that never quite fades. The question is not whether we can erase it. We cannot. The question is whether we are willing to face it, to acknowledge it, and to seek justice for those whose voices were silenced so long ago. Reparations, the act of making amends for historical wrongs, are often seen as an impossible ideal. How can we truly pay for the suffering of those who lived and died in a time so far removed from our own? How can we possibly right the wrongs that have been buried beneath layers of history, each generation moving farther from the truth? Yet, in the struggle for justice, these questions must be asked. Without reparations, without acknowledgement, there can be no closure, no healing. We cannot move forward until we have reckoned with the past. Cultural restitution, too, plays a role in this process. The artifacts and treasures stolen from civilizations along the Silk Road are not just objects of historical value. They are symbols of a stolen past, of cultures erased and lives destroyed. To return these treasures is to restore dignity to those who were robbed of it. It is a recognition that their story, their culture, their contributions are not just part of the past. They are part of us, part of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The act of cultural restitution is not merely about objects, but about restoring the voice of the silenced, the erased, the forgotten. But the road to justice is long, and often it seems endless. For every step forward, there are countless setbacks. There are those who resist, who argue that the past should be left behind, that we should not dwell on old wrongs. These voices of denial are loud, but they do not speak the truth. They do not speak to the pain that still echoes through the generations, to the legacy of trauma that continues to affect those who are still living. The scars of the Silk Road, the wounds inflicted upon the bodies and souls of countless men, women, and children, are not healed simply by forgetting. They are healed by remembering, by confronting the horrors of the past, and seeking justice for those who suffered. Healing is not just a personal journey. It is a collective one. It is a journey that we must take together as a society. We cannot heal as individuals while ignoring the wounds of the collective. The sins of the past are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger system of exploitation, of injustice, that continues to affect us all. The journey to justice requires that we recognize our shared responsibility, that we acknowledge the role we play in perpetuating these systems of oppression, whether consciously or unconsciously. We must take responsibility for the ways in which we benefit from the suffering of others, and we must work together to dismantle the systems that continue to cause harm. The truth is that healing will never be complete. There is no full resolution, no ultimate closure. The scars will always remain, like faded tattoos that speak of a time long past but never fully erased. The journey to justice is not about finding a perfect ending. It is about the act of confronting, of engaging with the past in a way that allows us to move forward with a deeper understanding, a deeper empathy, and a greater commitment to making the world a better place. Perhaps the most difficult question of all is whether we, as a society, are truly capable of healing. Can we fully reckon with the sins of the past, or are we destined to live with the legacy of history, forever haunted by its ghosts? The answer is not simple. It requires that we acknowledge the pain, the suffering, and the injustice that have been woven into the very fabric of our world. It requires that we confront the darkness within ourselves, within our systems, and within our history. The road to justice is long and fraught with obstacles, but if we are willing to walk it, if we are willing to confront the past, to acknowledge the suffering that has been ignored for so long, and to seek true justice, then perhaps, just perhaps, we can begin to heal. It will not be easy. It will take time, but it is the only way forward. The road to justice is not an easy one, but it is the only one that leads to true healing. We may never fully heal, not in the way we imagine, but we can strive for something more. A world where the sins of the past are acknowledged, where justice is sought, and where the legacy of suffering is not allowed to continue unchallenged. That is a world worth fighting for. It is the world we must create, one painful step at a time. In the quiet spaces of history, when we dare to look into the past, we are confronted with a reflection, a dark mirror that does not lie. The Silk Road, an ancient thread of trade that once connected the East to the West, is not merely a collection of routes and empires. It is a testament to the forces that shape human nature: power, greed, and exploitation. It is a mirror that, when held up to our world today, shows us the uncomfortable truth of who we are, who we have always been, and who we continue to be. The empires that rose along the Silk Road, from the Romans to the Mongols, from the Persians to the Chinese, were built on the backs of the oppressed. The wealth that flowed through these lands, the treasures traded across continents, were not the result of noble endeavor or fair exchange. They were the product of human suffering. Every silken garment, every piece of pottery, every precious gem was tainted by the blood, sweat, and tears of those who were enslaved, exploited, and subjugated. And yet, this cycle persists. As the centuries pass, the names and faces change, but the mechanisms of oppression remain remarkably consistent. In today's world, we see the same patterns unfolding, though they are often disguised in the language of progress and civilization. Corporate greed has replaced the merchant caravans of old, and the exploitation of labor is no longer hidden in the fields of ancient China or Persia, but behind the closed doors of factories, warehouses, and sweatshops that span the globe. The Silk Road taught us, painfully, that the pursuit of wealth and power is never a neutral act. Every empire, every corporation, every society that has risen to prominence has done so by extracting from those who have no power, no voice, no choice. The stories of the past, of slaves forced to carry goods across deserts, of families torn apart, of entire cultures erased, are not just relics of history. They are warnings, warnings that, if we choose to ignore them, will ensure that we repeat the mistakes of those who came before us. Look around. What do you see? The same patterns, the same structures of inequality, the same systems of exploitation. We live in a world where the wealthiest 1% control more than half of the planet's resources, while billions of people struggle to survive. We live in a world where corporations extract profits from the earth with little regard for the environmental devastation they leave behind. The natural world, like the human spirit, is being consumed in a cycle of endless exploitation. Perhaps most chilling of all is how deeply ingrained this system has become. The Silk Road may have been an ancient trade route, but it was never just about goods. It was about the exchange of power, and we still live within the shadow of that exchange. Every time we buy something made by an invisible hand, every time we see a product with no face, no story, we are participating in a system that, at its core, still thrives on the exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few. And what about the environment? The Silk Road was not just a conduit for goods, it was a conduit for destruction. The greed of the empires that controlled it led to the deforestation of vast regions, to the depletion of resources that once sustained ancient civilizations. Today, we see the same pattern playing out on a global scale. Our obsession with growth, with profit, with consumption is tearing apart the very fabric of the earth. Rainforests are being razed, oceans polluted, entire ecosystems decimated. And once again, it is the most vulnerable, the most powerless, who bear the brunt of this destruction. But as we stand on the edge of this abyss, we are also confronted with a question. What will the history of today's world say about us in 1,000 years? How will future generations look back on us? Will they see us as a people who stood idly by while the world burned, while the poor suffered, while the planet withered? Or will they see us as those who finally broke the chains of exploitation, who fought for justice, who chose a different path? It is a heavy question, one that does not have an easy answer. We live in a world where it is all too easy to turn a blind eye, to numb ourselves to the suffering around us. It is easier to buy the newest gadget, to indulge in our comforts, to look the other way when we hear of injustice. But the mirror of the Silk Road, the dark mirror that reflects our history, asks us not to look away. It asks us to confront the truth that we are not so different from those who came before us, that we are still part of the same cycle of exploitation, still trapped in the same patterns of greed and power. But there is hope, though it is faint. The history of the Silk Road is not just a history of oppression. It is also a history of resistance, of those who fought back, who refused to be silenced. It is a history of small victories, of moments when the human spirit broke free from the chains that sought to bind it. In the darkness of the past, there were glimmers of light, and in the darkness of our present, there are still those who are fighting for justice, for equality, for a world that values people over profit. And so, the question remains, what will we do? Will we be complicit in the cycle of exploitation that has lasted for millennia? Or will we finally break free, confront our past, and change the course of our future? The choice is ours, but the consequences of that choice will echo for generations to come. The mirror is before us. We can either look away, or we can look deeply into it and change the reflection. In the end, the Silk Road teaches us one fundamental truth. History is not just a record of what has happened. It is a warning, and it is up to us whether we heed it or let it repeat itself. In the quiet corners of the world, there are echoes, faint whispers carried on the wind, tracing the paths of the past, lingering where human suffering once echoed through the ages. The Silk Road, once a bustling artery of trade and power, now stands as a relic, a reminder of what was sacrificed. Beneath the weight of its rich history, there lies a darkness, a cost so heavy it can never be fully accounted for. The lives lost, the bodies forgotten, the souls erased from memory. They remain, not in the annals of history books, but in the very bones of the earth. This is the final cost of the Silk Road, and it is a cost we are still paying. To look at the past is to see it through a distorted lens. We romanticize the ancient empires, the luxury goods, the fabled cities, and we forget the blood that flowed to make those empires grand. We forget the slaves who carried the weight of the world on their backs, the children who never saw the light of freedom, the women whose bodies were bargained for trade. We tell ourselves stories of progress, of cultural exchange, of commerce and civilization, but beneath these stories is the undeniable truth that the Silk Road, in all its glory, was built on the exploitation and suffering of countless human beings. And yet, it is not enough to simply acknowledge this truth. To remember is not enough. To remember and to do nothing, to let the past slip into the shadows, to allow it to fade, is to dishonor those who suffered, those whose lives were cut short by the wheels of history. It is to erase their existence once more, to ignore the debt we owe them. The true cost of the Silk Road is not found in the gold and silk that were exchanged, but in the lives lost, in the memories forgotten, in the justice that was never served. Memory is a fragile thing. It fades over time, like a photograph left too long in the sun, its colors bleeding out until all that is left is a ghost of what once was. We remember what is convenient, what is easy to remember, but we forget what is painful, what is uncomfortable. We forget the bodies that were discarded along the route, the silent screams that were never heard. We forget the generations of people whose pain was commodified, whose suffering was erased in the name of progress. And in forgetting, we lose something essential. We lose our humanity. The question we must ask is not whether we can ever atone for the sins of the past. We can never fully erase the debt owed to those who came before us, but we can honor their memory. We can remember, and in remembering, we can begin the difficult work of justice. Justice is not a simple thing. It is not a matter of righting every wrong, of undoing every harm, but it is a matter of bearing witness to the truth, of acknowledging the suffering that was endured, of saying, "We see you, we hear you, we remember." This is where the journey of healing begins, in memory. Memory is the cornerstone of justice. Without it, we cannot understand the true cost of our actions, and without that understanding, we cannot make amends. Justice is not just for the living, it is for those who no longer have a voice, for those whose stories have been buried in the sands of time. We owe it to them and to ourselves to keep their memory alive, to pass their stories down to future generations, to ensure that they are never forgotten. But what happens when we forget? What happens when we choose to ignore the suffering of others? When we allow their pain to slip through the cracks of history, never to be acknowledged? The answer is simple. We repeat it. The suffering of the past becomes the suffering of the present, and the cycle continues. When we forget, we turn a blind eye to the injustices of the world, and in doing so, we become complicit in them. The past does not remain in the past. It lives on in every decision we make, in every system of oppression that continues to thrive. This is why memory is so important. Memory is not just an act of reflection. It is an act of responsibility. It is an act of resistance. To remember the suffering of the Silk Road is to resist the erasure of history, to challenge the systems that continue to perpetuate injustice. It is to say that we will not let the bodies of the forgotten remain silent. It is to recognize that the cost of history is not just measured in gold or goods, but in human lives, in human dignity, in human suffering. As we reflect on the past, we must ask ourselves, what will we remember? Will we remember the riches, the empires, the grandeur, or will we remember the price that was paid for it all? The cost of the bodies, the cost of the souls, the cost of the lives that were lost. Will we remember the people who were sacrificed to build the world we now live in? And will we do something about it? It is not enough to simply remember. We must act. We must honor the memory of those who came before us by fighting for a world that is just, that is equitable, that does not repeat the mistakes of the past. We must ensure that their suffering was not in vain, that their voices will not be silenced again. The work of justice is ongoing. It is never finished, but it begins with memory, with the willingness to confront the past, to acknowledge the cost, and to say, never again. The final cost of the Silk Road is not measured in the wealth it generated or the goods that were traded. It is measured in the lives that were destroyed, the histories that were lost, and the justice that was never realized. And the question we must ask is not just about the past, but about the future. What happens when we forget the cost of human suffering? The answer is simple. We become part of the cycle. We become complicit, and the suffering continues. But there is still time to change. There is still time to remember, to act, and to honor those who came before us. It is a long road, but it begins with a single step, the step of remembering.